The earth shall sit in mourning. Late summer, 541, and the Egyptian sun was at its most broiling. Those who lived along the shoreline might well have turned their faces to the sea for the blessed relief that a breeze on the cheeks could bring. That August, however, there was something eerie to be seen out on the water, a sight fit not to cool, but to chill the blood. Phantasms were sailing the sea. As the sun set and twilight thickened to darkness, dozens of spectral bronze ships, glowing like fire, grew more distinct on the horizon. Sitting on their decks were men with bronze staffs, and those who travelled in these glittering boats, moving at an unearthly speed across the sea, were black, and they had no heads. Soon enough, it became clear that these ghostly apparitions were not appearing merely at random, but were tracking along the coast. By the end of the month, one fleet of the bronze ships had left Egyptian waters altogether and were observed off Gaza. Meanwhile, a second fleet was heading westwards. Past the various mouths of the Nile it glided, until, as August turned into September, it had almost left the delta behind. Ahead stood the greatest port in the entire Mediterranean, where the sight of red and orange light flickering on nighttime waves was hardly a novelty, for its harbours boasted a watchtower of such stupefying height that the beacon which blazed from the summit of the structure could be seen up to 50 miles out at sea. Wonders, certainly, were nothing new at Alexandria. The very name of the city bore witness to its glamorous pedigree. Not even Constantinople could boast a founder to compare with Alexander the Great. Planted on the Mediterranean coast, fashioned out of the marble which had long served as the badge of cosmopolitan chic, and with the Pharos, its astounding lighthouse, to illumine the international shipping lanes, the city had always defined itself as haughtily, indeed defiantly, Greek. Its inhabitants liked to call it Alexandria by Egypt, as though to do otherwise might risk their being submerged beneath the peasant-worked mud of the Nile. Geography could not be totally denied, though. Right from the beginning, Alexandria had been touched by schizophrenia. Alexander, travelling to the spit of land on which he would found his great city, had journeyed from Siwa, an oracle in the depths of the western desert, where Amun, the ram-headed king of the Egyptian gods, had revealed to him the secrets of his destiny, and instructed him, it may be, to found Alexandria. This is why, on coins minted by his successors, the great conqueror had often been shown sporting the two curling horns of Amun, an image that had perfectly fused traditions of Greek portraiture with those of the ancient and mysterious land that Alexander had brought beneath his rule. In similar manner, the greatest temple in Alexandria, a massive complex of shrines, libraries, and lecture halls named the Serapeum, had been raised in honour of Serapis, a deity who combined a thoroughly Greek beard and robe with a primordially Egyptian lineage. Artificially multicultural the god may have been, but that was precisely what had rendered him the perfect patron for a city such as Alexandria, created as it had been from nothing, and poised between two very different worlds. Yet if gods could be created, then so too, of course, could they be killed. 8 centuries had passed since the founding of Alexandria, and in that time the cults that had once dominated the city had passed into oblivion. It was hardly to be wondered at, perhaps, in a place that had played host to the gods of both Olympus and the Nile for so long, that certain marks of paganism should still have lingered, but as memorials now to a toppled order. Sail into the easternmost of Alexandria's harbours, for instance, and there, dominating the waterfront, the traveller would see a massive temple precinct, originally built by a Greek queen, and fronted by plundered obelisks, but which had served the city's bishop for more than a century now as his cathedral. Not that the birth pangs of a Christian Alexandria had been easy, though. The Alexandrians were notorious for their rebellion and rioting, and the convulsions that had accompanied the overthrow of paganism had been predictably bruising. In 391, when a mob of Christians had attempted to storm the Serapeum, the pagans had fought back. They had barricaded the gates of the temple and, so it was plausibly reported, nailed Christian prisoners to crosses on its walls. Such resistance, of course, had only made the eventual capture of the temple all the sweeter. Its 750-year-old statue of Serapis had been hacked to pieces, the contents of its libraries destroyed, and its various buildings either converted to Christian worship or left as mouldering shells. Alexandria, once the intellectual powerhouse of paganism, had been reconsecrated as something new, as the most glorious and Christ-loving city of the Alexandrians. Christ-loving or not, though, it still maintained, in the opinion of a long succession of Christian emperors, its reputation as a nest of troublemakers. It had not gone unnoted, for instance, that Arius had originally been from Alexandria. In point of fact, however, the city's tradition of inquiry into the nature of God, a uniquely brilliant and searching one, had always preferred to stress the opposite extreme to that of Arianism, downplaying the human nature of the Saviour and emphasizing the divine. Any hint of a counter-argument, any suggestion that Christ might after all have had two natures rather than one, would invariably prompt in the Alexandrians an explosion of mingled scorn and fury that was inimitably their own. One inheritance from their pagan forebears that they had most certainly not discarded was an unshakable conviction that they were, quite simply, the cleverest people in the world. The Patriarch of Alexandria, with imperious immodesty, had even taken to calling himself the Judge of the Universe. Others, less flatteringly, labelled him a new pharaoh. Certainly, the patriarchs had more than intellectual firepower at their fingertips. Intimidation might come physical as well. The trendsetter here was Athanasius, the bishop who had first definitively catalogued the books of the New Testament. Back in the 4th century, he had ruled Alexandria with a rod of iron, not hesitating to have his opponents beaten up or kidnapped if the situation demanded it. A century later, and it had been the turn of another patriarch, Dioscorus, to blend rarefied theology with the tactics of a gangland boss. Travelling to Ephesus in 449 for a showdown with the Nestorians of Antioch, he took with him an escort of paramilitaries so rowdy and intimidating that his fellow bishops, shocked to find themselves howled down every time they opened their mouths, termed the summit, in outrage, the Robber Council. Parabolani, these thugs of Dioscorus had been called, black-robed enforcers who worked ostensibly as hospital attendants, but who, whenever summoned by the Patriarch, would cheerfully demonstrate their devotion to Christ through often spectacular displays of violence. Pagans, Jews, heretics, all felt their fists. By introducing the Parabolani onto the international stage, however, Dioscorus had fatefully overreached himself. The Council of Chalcedon, summoned 2 years after the debacle of Ephesus, pointedly refused to legitimize the Monophysite doctrines that had been so subtly honed in Alexandria. The result was a standoff. As self-confident in the superiority of their own intellects as they had ever been, most Alexandrians dismissed Chalcedon's resolutions with predictable contempt. The threat of violence continued to smoulder, and occasionally to burst into flames. In 457, for instance, after the distant emperor had ousted the disgraced Dioscorus and foisted a replacement on the Alexandrians, an indignant mob hacked down the wretched new patriarch in one of his own churches, and paraded his mangled corpse in triumph through the streets. No mob like an Alexandrian mob for combining intellectual snobbery with a taste for atrocities. Nevertheless, in the sheer scale of hostility to Chalcedon, there was something new. Rarefied debates about the nature of the universe were no longer, as they had been in pagan times, the sole preserve of the metropolis. Across the whole vast expanse of Egypt, whether in the churches of obscure provincial towns or in monasteries out in the desert, few were those who doubted that Christ had only the single nature. Indeed, the province was so teeming with monophysites that they increasingly came to be known simply as Copts, an abbreviation of the Greek word for Egyptians. At last, after centuries of scorning and exploiting its hinterland, Alexandria had come to speak for the whole of Egypt. The result was a display of mass disobedience fit to give even Justinian pause. Only in 536, buoyed by his successes in Italy, had he finally presumed to reprise the measure first attempted in 457, and impose his own choice of patriarch upon the recalcitrant Alexandrians, a step greeted by the Alexandrians themselves as the opening up of the pit of the abyss. Such hysteria was hardly surprising, for Justinian's nominee, a monk from the Delta by the name of Paul, had known better than to take for granted the obedience of his new flock. Rather than risk the fate of his hapless predecessor, he had opted instead to get his own blows in first, a policy that had served to confirm for the Alexandrians all their darkest suspicions of the Chalcedonian Church. Their new patriarch, even by the autocratic standards of his predecessors, verged on the psychopathic. Corrupt, brutal, and with a taste for spilling blood, so uninhibited was his thuggery that Justinian, after a couple of years, was prepared to acknowledge something startling, that he might perhaps have made a mistake. Paul was duly sacked. A new patriarch, a Syrian by the name of Zoilus, was dispatched from Constantinople as his replacement. The Alexandrians, scorning their new leader as both a foreigner and a Chalcedonian, but finding him otherwise inoffensive, opted simply to ignore him. So ended Justinian's project to reunite Egypt with the imperial church, amid inglorious compromise. As perhaps had always been inevitable, the Copts were simply too numerous, too distant, and too monophysite to be brought to heel. Nor were these the only considerations weighing on Justinian's mind. It was no coincidence, surely, that the squalid episode of Paul's tenure in Alexandria coincided with a far more crowd-pleasing initiative, the closure, in an isolated Libyan oasis, of the very last functioning temple of Amun. This step, although clearly taken in accordance with the wishes of the heavens, was not wholly devoid of earthly calculation. For Justinian was keen to remind the Copts that he and they, despite their disagreements, were all of them lovers of Christ. Urgent though it clearly was to secure the unity of the Church, it was no less urgent to ensure the continued loyalty of Egypt, and thereby to secure for the vast population of Constantinople and the soldiers of the Eastern Front the incomparable harvests sprung from the floodplains of the Nile. Every year, gliding downriver to Alexandria, great fleets of barges would bring hundreds upon thousands of tons of grain, and every year giant ships would then transport the precious cargo onwards to the capital. Alexandria might have been a marble-clad cosmopolis of lecture halls and churches, but she was no less an entrepot of warehouses, docks, and silos. Had she not been, the new Rome would long since have found the flesh shrinking off her bones. For Constantinople and all the region around it are fed, in the main, by Alexandria. Yet in the summer of 541, as the ghostly fleet of bronze ships appeared along the Mediterranean coast, it was becoming terrifyingly clear that death, too, as well as life, might be had from Egypt. In July, reports had reached Alexandria of an epidemic in the port of Pelusium, on the far eastern side of the Nile Delta, that had left the city a charnel house. Panic at this news, however, was unlikely to have been immediate, for sudden flare-ups of disease were common, and usually, by the grace of God which protects us, do not last long. The outbreak in Pelusium, however, had not abated. Instead, from coastal town to coastal town it had begun to spread with lethal speed. Every time a bronze ship was spotted out on the nighttime waters, people on the shore would abruptly find themselves struck down by a fever, and then, touching their groins or their armpits or behind their ears, discover painful black swellings, bubones, as they were called in Greek, until finally, it might be, staggering out into the streets, they would fall and become a terrible and shocking spectacle for those who saw them, as their bellies were swollen and their mouths wide open, throwing up pus like torrents, their eyes inflamed, and their hands stretched out upward and over the corpses that lay rotting on corners, and in the porches of courtyards, and in churches, and everywhere, with no one to bury them. And so the pestilence raged, and as it raged, it drew ever closer to Alexandria. By September, the first headaches, the first buboes, the first rattling expectorations of blood were being reported in the docks. Within days, the plague was general over the city and far beyond. Alexandria, ever the intellectual powerhouse, boasted the most prestigious medical schools in the world. But even the city's famous teaching specialists found themselves helpless before the spread of the mysterious pestilence, unable to diagnose it, still less prescribe any cure. The death rate rose inexorably, until many houses became completely destitute of human inhabitants. So putrid were the streets with piles of the dead, so thick with flies, so slippery underfoot with blood and melted flesh, that it was impossible to clear them. Those who dared to venture out into the fetid heat, whether to loot or simply to scavenge food, wore tags so that their families could be alerted to come and bury them should they too be overwhelmed by the plague while abroad. Unless, of course, as was entirely probable, their families had themselves been struck down in the meanwhile. Nor, the observant noted, was it only humans who were perishing of the epidemic. Animals too were succumbing. Why, even rats, swollen with buboes, were to be seen infected and dying. Week after week the pestilence continued its scything progress. Then, finally, it began to subside, until at last, 4 months after its first appearance on the streets of Alexandria, the dying was largely done. Yet the plague, always moving forward and travelling at times favourable to it, was still far from spent. Traders from Egypt might sail as far afield as Britain, and those who had survived the pestilence still needed to make a living. In the spring of 542, as the storms of winter died down, the ships of Alexandria started to put out to sea, bearing with them their freights of merchandise, papyrus and linen, spices and medicines, glassware and exotic sweets. Pet birds, too, and even camels were sometimes transported. And then, of course, travelling as stowaways, there were always rats. On the rats were fleas, and in the fleas was Yersinia pestis, the deadly pathogen that, unknown to anyone, was spreading the plague. The science of bacteriology, it went without saying, lay immeasurably beyond the orbit of the scholarship of the age. Even the most brilliant of Alexandria's doctors did not think to associate the spread of a pandemic so lethal and unprecedented with anything so commonplace as a flea bite. The result was, as ships fanned out across the Mediterranean, that the pestilence too, invisible and unsuspected, continued on its deadly way. Sometimes it happened, in the midst of a voyage, that a vessel would be attacked so suddenly by the wrath of God, and to such devastating effect, that it would be left to drift aimlessly on the currents, manned by nothing but corpses, until it sank or ran aground. More commonly, a ship would dock in some distant port, and then, a day or two later, the first buboes would start to appear on the groins and armpits of the locals. And always, after beginning on the coast, the disease would then head on inland. In Constantinople, rumours of doom had been sweeping the city for months. Back in the autumn of 541, as Alexandria had been twisting upon the rack, a woman had fallen into a rapture and cried out to the Byzantines that death was arriving from the sea to swallow up the world. The following spring, with the first grain ships of the year looming off the Golden Horn, and granaries along the harbour front busily being filled, so mysterious apparitions began to be glimpsed. Whoever was touched by one of these phantoms would immediately fall sick. Within days, across the whole of Constantinople, thousands upon thousands were dying. At first, only the poor perished, but soon even the most exclusive quarters of the city were succumbing. Such was the lethal effect of the plague's spread, that entire palaces might be transformed into sepulchres, their mosaic floors littered with corpses, senators and servants alike left as pus-streaked food for worms. Even in the imperial palace, in the bedchamber of the emperor himself, the burning mark of the plague was felt, for Justinian too fell ill. That he went on to recover was proof that the pestilence, though virulent, was not necessarily fatal, for there were some, a small minority, who did survive infection. Whether this was necessarily a blessing, however, was debatable, for what pleasure could there be in life if spouse and children, friends and kin were all of them dead? Certainly, to those who lived through that summer in Constantinople, the entire city appeared condemned. The streets were empty of the living. No business of any kind was undertaken, save for the burying of corpses. The butchers' shops stood empty, the markets deserted, the bakers' kilns unlit. So it was, in a city prodigiously full of good things to eat, that starvation ran riot. The pestilence, adding to all the manifold sufferings that it had already dealt, now trailed famine in its wake. To many of those who survived its passage, the plague appeared a calamity by which the whole of humanity came close to annihilation. An exaggeration? Perhaps, but then again, accurate figures were hard to come by. The imperial statisticians had tried to keep track of the death rate in the capital, but had fast been overwhelmed. In due course, confronted by the mounds of corpses in the streets, Justinian gave orders for them to be dumped at sea, and then, as the water turned into a soup of decomposing flesh, for vast pits to be dug on the far side of the Golden Horn. Within these, rows of bodies were laid and then trodden upon by feet and trampled like spoiled grapes, so that further corpses, when they were hurled down from the rim of the pit, would sometimes vanish into the mulch. To those haunted by such a hellish vision, the entire world seemed to have become a winepress, in which countless multitudes were being crushed by the wrath of God. Even though the plague, by August 542, had finally spent itself in Constantinople, reports of its onward sweep across the rest of the empire and beyond did not diminish in horror. Asia Minor, too, it was reported, had been visited by the pestilence, and Jerusalem, and the rubble-strewn shanty-town that was Antioch. By December, it was endemic in Sicily, and by 543, across much of Italy, Spain, and Gaul. That the West could boast no cities on the scale of those to be found in the East did not serve to spare it. In the most remote village, no less than in the darkest urban slum, the pestilence stalked down the living. The world seemed returned to its primordial silence, for no voices rose in the fields, no whistling was heard of shepherds. So it was reported of the Italian countryside. Places where men once lived had become lairs for savage beasts. Meanwhile, Along the eastern frontier of Justinian's empire, where Khusro had frantically constructed a cordon sanitaire, the plague was briefly halted in its tracks. One outbreak of buboes in the ranks of the Shahanshah's own army had been effectively quarantined, and another in Media. But the pestilence could not be kept at bay forever. By 545, it had breached the bulwarks of Iran Shah and was sweeping eastwards with a violence even more terrible, if anything, than it had displayed on its westward course. Across Mesopotamia in particular, it raged for longer than it had ever done in Alexandria or Constantinople, so that all was famine, madness, and fury. Nothing was proof against it. Time would see it spread as far afield as China. Never before in history had so much of humanity been united by a common experience of suffering. If some communities were wiped out utterly by the plague, and some were mysteriously spared, then most, if reports are collated and the evidence carefully sifted, appear to have suffered a mortality rate of something around a third. Not annihilation, then, by any means, but a culling, nevertheless, on a wholly shattering scale. Always, however, after every visitation, the time would come when even the evil stench of the rotting corpses would lift, and people, rubbing their eyes, would emerge onto weed-covered streets or fields. Many of them, artisans, tradesmen, peasants, found the world they were returning to ripe with unanticipated opportunity. The ready supplies of labour that the wealthy had hitherto always taken for granted were suddenly at a premium. Demands that previously, before the coming of the plague, the poor would never have dared to push, were now increasingly theirs to make. Inflation, as a result, began to gallop. By 545, just 3 years after the departure of the plague from Constantinople, Justinian was appalled to discover that wages in the capital had more than doubled. The emperor's response to this unsettling state of affairs was his habitual one. He passed a law. By its terms, it was declared illegal for any labourer to be paid more than he would have received prior to the plague. The effect of this legislation, to Justinian's bafflement and indignation, was minimal. Wages continued to spiral upwards. The world, it seemed, was not to be restored to its former conditions simply on the say-so of an edict. And in truth, there was barely a sinew, barely a muscle of the great machine of imperial administration that had not been left enfeebled by the pestilence. Physicians noted with interest that those who had contracted the plague and survived would invariably bear the stamp of their brush with death. Some were left bald, others with a lisp, others with a staggering, lurching gait. Almost all suffered a terrible lassitude, often for years. To this rule, it was true, Justinian himself stood as a notable exception, but he knew, none better, that what might be true of individuals was true as well of his entire dominion. Infinitely more than the feckless tribes of the barbarians, more even than the kingdom of Khusro, the empire of the Roman people had always depended on a sizable population for its healthy functioning. Civilian state that it essentially was, it could not hope to prosper without a hefty tax base. Now, in the wake of the plague, that tax base had suffered perhaps irreparable damage. Nor was that the limit of the danger. In provinces that only a few years previously had provided ready supplies of recruits for the imperial armies, whole villages, whole regions now stood denuded. This, at the best of times, would have posed a formidable challenge. At a moment when Roman forces were engaged in a number of debilitating conflicts, from Italy to Syria, it threatened catastrophe. As for Justinian himself, so devastating and unexpected had been the blow to all his ambitions that he might well have been expected to buckle under it. But he did not. Instead, grimly, doggedly, heroically, he set to shoring up his battered empire against utter ruin. From the summer of 548 onwards, he would be forced to do so without the woman who for over 20 years had been the companion both of his bed and of his counsels. For, in June that year, Theodora died. Justinian, who for the rest of his life would never cease to light candles before the mausoleum which he had built to serve the pair of them as their final resting place, could not endure to take another wife. Henceforward he would be married to his work. Day and night, for he had little need of sleep, he devoted himself to the thankless task of compensating for the most precipitous drop in revenue that any emperor had ever faced. Ruthless austerity measures were imposed, courier services slashed, road maintenance abandoned, the civil service streamlined. Tax collection was overtly professionalized, so as to throttle any prospect of evasion. Even the manufacture of silk was nationalized. Such measures won for Justinian, against all the odds, funding sufficient to bring his many wars to a seemingly satisfactory close. By the time of his death in 565, he had stabilized the eastern frontier by signing yet another eternal peace with Khusro, and decisively defeated the Ostrogoths in the west. He had even acquired a whole new province in southern Spain. Only fitting, then, it might have been thought, that the body of the great emperor, as it lay in state, had been covered by a pall on which he was shown trampling down a barbarian king, of the kind that it had always been the traditional prerogative of the Roman people to crush. Happy days, so the image proclaimed, were come again. But the pall told only part of the story. Its portrait of the emperor as the youthful and Christ-favoured visionary who, in the joyous year of 534, had sat in triumph over the Vandals, veiled the withered corpse of an 83-year-old man. Between the image of an empire restored to its ancient supremacy over most of the Mediterranean and the grim reality, there stretched a similarly yawning chasm. In the opinion of Justinian's critics, of whom behind closed doors there were many, the emperor's cure had proved quite as deadly as the disease. In Italy, for instance, no matter how shrilly his propagandists might seek to deny it, victory had left the peninsula immeasurably less Roman than it had ever been under Theodoric. Over the course of 2 decades, the bloody and wearisome slog to overthrow the Ostrogoths had witnessed the abolition of the consulship, the flight to Constantinople of almost every senator, and even, during the winter months of 550, the most shocking of all the breaks with the past, the complete, albeit temporary, depopulation of Rome itself. Not since the time of Romulus had the eternal city stood so empty, so abandoned to grass and swamps. Victory of such an order seems scarcely different from defeat. Why, then, had Justinian waded through a whole mire of destruction to secure it? Because he was bloodthirsty and murderous by nature, some thought to whisper. That his reign had seen the entire world drenched with human blood was due not to his desperate struggle against evil circumstance, but to the startling fact that he had literally been an agent of hell. Even his tireless burning of the midnight oil might be interpreted as evidence, not of his devotion to the Roman people, but of his diabolic nature. One servant had reported seeing Justinian late at night without his head. Another that the emperor's face had suddenly metamorphosed into a hideous and shapeless lump of flesh. How, then, could this man have been anything other than a demon? Admittedly, those who pushed this particular theory did tend to have axes to grind. Justinian, never popular with the traditional elite at the best of times, had hardly risen in their estimation by taking such strenuous measures in the years before his death to slash the budget deficit. Nothing about him quite so infernal in the opinion of stymied tax dodgers as what they bitterly dismissed as his avarice. Nevertheless, it was hardly necessary to believe that the imperial throne had genuinely been occupied by the Lord of Demons to dread that the gates of hell might be yawning increasingly wide. Zoroastrian priests were not alone in warning their flocks that time itself was destined to come to an end, amid a titanic death struggle between good and evil. The same mood of mingled terror and hope that had inspired Mazdak to declare that the horizon was not far off, that the great climax of things was drawing near, had repeatedly haunted the imaginings of the Christian people too. Christ himself had warned his disciples what to expect. His own return, like lightning, that comes from the east and shines as far as the west. His sitting in judgment over the living and the dead. His delivery of the wicked to eternal punishment, and of the righteous to eternal life. And the day and hour of these events? Not even the angels themselves, so Christ had declared, could be sure of that. Nevertheless, certain clues, certain signs would herald for the faithful the coming of the day of judgment. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in various places. In the wake of Justinian's reign, this was a message as unsettling as any in Scripture. The plague, after its initial devastating eruption, had still not abated. By striking seemingly at random at different times and in different places, it cast a perpetual shadow of menace. Its recurrence, so a lawyer in Antioch recorded in numb despair, has seen me lose at various times several of my children, my wife, and many of my kin, not to mention numerous servants, both in town and in the country. Time would see him lose a grandson as well, a pattern of bereavement repeated across the empire and far beyond. Yet pestilence was only one of the harbingers of the end days to have afflicted the Roman people. Prior to the plague's appearance, back in 536, a mysterious dust cloud had cast the world into darkness for months. Then, in December 557, a terrible earthquake had shaken Constantinople, rocking it so severely that the dome of Hagia Sophia had collapsed the following spring, necessitating years of repairs. Most ominous of all, in 559, an army of barbarians had crossed the frozen Danube and struck so far south as to menace Greece and the capital itself. Constantinople had been preserved from seemingly inevitable ruin only by the desperate summoning of Belisarius out of retirement, for the aged general, frail though he had become, had lost none of his aptitude for winning victories. Elsewhere, however, the rising tempo of barbarian assaults had proved less easy to repulse. Bands of migratory peasants, known as Slavs, had been infiltrating the Balkans since the 540s, when the plague had first harrowed the region. Then, from beyond the Danube, a tribe of peculiarly brutal savages, steppe-land nomads named the Avars, had started to make alarming demands for danger money. Most demoralizing of all, perhaps, was the descent upon Italy in 568 of a shaven-headed, long-bearded people called the Lombards, who in next to no time had succeeded in dismembering Constantinople's hard-won mastery of the peninsula for good. Less than a decade after the death of Justinian, the imperial control had been pegged back to a corridor of land between Ravenna and Rome. So much blood, so much destruction, and all in vain. How were these catastrophic eruptions to be explained? On one level, the answer was very simple. Nomads, by and large, had proved immune to the reach of the plague. As a result, whether descending across the Danube or from the Alps, they usually vastly outnumbered the local garrisons. Even Belisarius, in his last-ditch defence of Constantinople, had been able to muster only a few hundred veterans, and had depended largely for his victory on a rag-bag of peasants and plenty of bluff. Elsewhere, for all the conscientiousness with which Justinian had devoted his tax revenues to the construction of fortresses along the empire's frontiers, Not even the most bristling of walls could be made serviceable without soldiers to man them. Time and again, as barbarian horsemen advanced into Roman territory, they would find themselves passing fields that stood overgrown, and villages that lay abandoned. Whole stretches of the empire, to all intents and purposes, were now deserted. All of this had long been foretold. Christ had not been alone in warning of how the world was destined to end. Jewish prophets and Christian saints alike had predicted that fearsome and savage hordes would descend on God's people like a cloud covering the land in the run-up to the end days, hordes of whom in the Bible had been given the sinister names Gog and Magog. The hint of dark mystery in all this had been sufficient, as the world had become increasingly Christian and barbarians ever more of a threat, to prompt much heated speculation. Who were Gog and Magog? Where were they lurking? Why would they not materialize until the end of time? The answers to these questions had been found, somewhat unexpectedly, in the biography of Alexander the Great. Historians had long known that the famous conqueror, in the course of his global travels, had discovered a mountain pass on the edge of the world which he had sealed with iron gates. Over the centuries, this story had been much improved. By the time of Justinian, it was known for a fact that the gates had been faced with bronze, that the peoples they had served to imprison had been none other than Gog and Magog, and that Alexander, upon whom the Spirit of the Lord rested, had built them with the direct encouragement of an angel. To the Christian people of Alexandria, this was not wholly bad news, perhaps. It provided a welcome reassurance that the founder of their city, despite his regrettable taste for sporting the horns of a pagan demon, had all along been a self-proclaimed servant of God. By and large, however, the implications were unnerving in the extreme. It was hard, with barbarians gathering outside the walls of Constantinople and the whole world seemingly on the move, to avoid the obvious conclusion that yet another portent of the end days had arrived upon the scene. The bolts set on Alexander's gates, so many dreaded, were starting to crumple and buckle and give. Beyond them, straining to be released upon the world, were waiting Gog and Magog, fiends so terrible that they thought nothing of drinking the blood of babies and snacking on kittens. Before the onset of such invaders, then, who could say what the fate of the world would be? No wonder, in the final years of the 6th Christian century, that many in the empire of the Romans should have looked to the future with a peculiar foreboding. Calamities are approaching, such as the current generation cannot imagine. A sobering reflection that the worst might be yet to come.